Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in the eastern and western flanks of Sucha in the Kursk region. The Russians also expanded their zone of control north of the Oskil river line close to the border area, gaining almost full control over the town adjacent to the border. The Russians also advanced further towards Kupiansk from the eastern section of the Kupiansk front line. The Russians expanded their zone of control west of the Sirbis river line, expanding their bridgehead across it and attempting to connect the two sides in the western and northern parts of it. The Russians also managed to advance the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, and they have managed to advance to the southern flank of Pokrovsk, northern flank of Kharkiv, near Velika Novosilka, and in the Zaporizhia section of the front line. Starting out in the Kursk region, following the capture of Svetlikovo Fort, the Russians have managed to capture an additional forest line east of the town as they move onwards towards the fortified positions alongside the border area. It was previously reported that the Russians have managed to enter into the Sumy region. There's been no significant developments in this direction. Instead, we are seeing that the Russian focus seems to be continuously in the Russian side of the border area, but we may see offensive operations by the Russians with the objective to reach Yunakivka and cut off the main road, bypassing the fortified positions alongside the Russian side of the border and entering into the Ukrainian sides along the Lugnia river line. At the same time, we also see the Russians have managed to advance in the eastern flank of Cherkasskaya Konopelka as they continue their offensive operations in the southern flank of Sucha in their attempt to flank the entire Kursk incursion and encircle the Ukrainian forces within the Kursk region through the capture of Sucha or the attack from the southern and northern flanks in an attempt to cut off the supply lines and therefore cut off the supplies going in and out of the Kursk incursion and to the Ukrainian frontline troops. In the direction of the Oskil river line, the Russians managed to advance further towards the northern and eastern outskirts of Topoli. They managed to flank the town and enter across the Oskil river line here north of Pisky in the direction of Topoli. Following this, they have managed to advance further to gain control over the northern outskirts of Topoli and the central parts of the town, and are now moving into the eastern parts to gain control over the border crossing and therefore have a crossing across the Oskil river line through the Russian side of the border, and with supplies going through the Pisky area, they'll be able to supply their forces along the Oskil river line and connect with their forces further south for offensive operations to start across the border area between the Russian and Ukrainian side of the Kharkiv and Belgorod regions. The difficulties presented for the Russians in this section of the front line is the lack of roads. As long as we are in this winter-spring period, it will be difficult for the Russians to supply their forces through off-road areas or dirt roads. Instead, they'll be more reliant on paved roads, such as the one going north of Yoalivka. However, these are sparse in this section of the front line. There's the one that goes through Liman Druhi and across Kamyanka and onwards towards Kolodyasne. The Russians may look to gain control over this area to connect the supply line there. And then there's the Pisky road that goes through the north towards Topoli and then through towards Kamyanka. And there we have several connections for the Russians to supply their forces across the Oskil river line, and therefore these are likely the targets for the Russian forces as they develop offensive operations towards the northern section of the front line here in the Kharkiv region. And then we can see that there could be a potential for further build-ups once the spring arrives towards the end of it or the start of summer. We may see the Russians using these off-roads and dirt roads to cross over the border area and build up offensive operations in this section of the front line. The objective would be to flank the defensive line of the Ukrainians here in the Kharkiv region by advancing through Devorishna and the eastern parts of the Kharkiv section. The reason why the Ukrainians have fewer fortified positions towards the east is because the limited supply lines and the Oskil river line as a natural barrier. Now that the Russians have crossed over and established a bridgehead, the Ukrainians need to defend by building new fortifications towards the eastern section of the front line and expand fortifications towards the end near the Oskil river line. However, this is difficult to do as the Russians are on the offensive. To the east of Kupiansk, the Russians continued offensive operations north of Stepovo-Novoselivka, where they managed to capture another forest line and some forest patches as they advanced alongside the open fields in the eastern parts of the Kupiansk section of the front line. This section of the front line has been very stale since the Russians were kicked out of the eastern parts of Kupiansk. Instead, we've seen some positional fighting along the southern parts to cut off the supplies going in and out of this pocket from the southern direction in Yasenkova. And with the capture of the Orishna in the north, we'll see that the Russians are focusing their efforts towards the Kupiansk direction and bypassing this eastern part of the front line. However, this could make the Ukrainians withdraw from the pocket, and therefore we likely see that the offensive operations by the Russians here towards the east is to keep the Ukrainian forces in place and prevent a withdrawal of their forces. Otherwise, they'll be attacking directly head on and prevent their withdrawal through that way. Further south along the Serbets River line, there's been several advances by the Russians. The Russians crossed over the Serbets River line near Novolyubivka, where they've managed to gain control over several crossings and connect with their forces from Ivanivka up towards Novolyubivka. And the objective is to fight over these fortified positions where the fighting is ongoing over right now, and this is why it's in the gray zone. And the Russians looking to gain full control over Novolyubivka through the flank maneuver, flanking the fortified positions from their rear. And this will allow the Russians to gain control over the crossings from Makiivka in the north and all the way to the Ivanivka in the south, connecting their crossings across the Serbets River line and expanding their bridgehead significantly. It will also allow the Russians to start fighting over the first line of defense, while the fighting over the second line of defense is ongoing, to connect their forces at the intersection further north and start the battle over Borova in the north and Lyman in the south through gaining control over all the crossings across the Serbets River line here to the east. So see that Russians have managed to gain control over the majority of Novolyubivka and are fighting over the fortified positions, control over which will allow the Russians to establish their control over the town or not. If they fail to do so, they'll likely be kicked back across the river line and back towards Ivanivka. But we see that the Russians have had a lot of success in this section of the front line. There's been some local Ukrainian counterattacks, but nothing larger, as this section of the front line is not prioritized, in contrary to the Kharkiv, Kursk, and Pokrovsk sections of the front line. The Russians also managed to capture this forest patch alongside the border area, the riverline area, where they're fighting alongside the river line towards the fortified positions and the forest patches in the area, getting control over the crossing near Makiivka and the fortified positions along the forest patches will allow the Russians to launch an operation to the south to connect with the forces near Novolyubivka. Further south in the direction east of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have managed to capture the northern parts of Ryorivka. However, the fighting is ongoing over the fortified positions to the northern outskirts of the town, control over which will allow the Russians gain control over the remaining parts of Ryorivka and align the front line further north alongside the canal and support their forces fighting near Orihovo-Vasilivka. At the same time, we also see that the Russians have control over the northern parts of Chasiv Yar, therefore the support for the Ukrainian forces near Ryorivka is limited. Gaining control over Ryorivka will allow the Russians to gain further control over the canal crossings in the area and strengthen their offensive operations in the northern flank of Chasiv Yar and cross over the canal to fight over and alongside it in a northern direction to flank the Ukrainian positions near Siversk. The Russians continued offensive operations near Pokrovsk, regaining control over some of these fortified positions to the west of the city and negating further of the Ukrainian regains through the counterattacks over the past few weeks, and the Russians are continuing their offensive operations towards the city of Pokrovsk. At the same time, the Russians also continued their fighting near Zaporizhia, gaining control over the central parts of the town and pushing the Ukrainians onwards to the western outskirts of it, and fighting is now moving onwards to Preobrazhenka. Both the Russian and Ukrainian forces are currently focusing on the Pokrovsk section of the front line, prioritizing it over any other section of the front line. This is why we're seeing a lot of back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in the area. The closer to the city of Pokrovsk, the heavier the Ukrainian resistance becomes. The Russians also managed to advance northwest of Velikonosilka, gaining control over additional fortified positions along the first line of defense here northwest of the town. And with the fighting near Novocheretovaty, it's only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control over the fortified positions and the towns surrounding them as they continue their offensive operations towards the outskirts of the Dnipropetrovsk region, at the outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians also managed to gain control over the eastern parts of Pyatkhy as they moved in a combined assault from the western and eastern directions. This allowed the Russians to gain control over several fortified positions near Pyatkhy. However, the Ukrainians still hold strong positions in the forest patch in the western parts and the several fortified positions both within Pyatkhy and Lobkove. Therefore, heavy fighting continues in this section of the front line, but the reactivation of the forces here in this section of the front line shows that the Russians are increasing the pressure on the Ukrainian forces all across the front line, with advances in every single section of it except for the Kharkiv region, where we're seeing fighting alongside the border area. While the Russians are on the offensive on the entire front line from the Kursk region in the north to the Zaporizhia section in the south, we see that there are some rumors circling Telegram right now that claim that the Ukrainians are making a troop buildup in the Sumy and Chernihiv regions for a potential offensive into the Bryansk region of the Russian side. Here it becomes very complicated because there are massive forest patches and forest areas here in the Bryansk region. This area could become very difficult for the Russians to deal with Ukrainian forces because Ukrainian infantry can enter it and walk around with FPV drones, dig in and keep supply lines going, as the Ukrainians can concentrate their forces in the forest, which is very difficult for anyone to detect soldiers moving in and out of these areas. And with FPV drones operating within the forest areas of Bryansk, they can hit a lot of military installations of the Russians and their supply lines going into the area, and they can support offensive operations by the Ukrainians into the region through the main highways to the east, near the northern parts of the Sumy region in this area, as well as in the west, where they can cut off the main highway going between Bryansk and the Belarus. Therefore, what we're seeing in this section of the front line is that if the Ukrainians are really building up their forces towards an offensive in the Bryansk region, it will become very complicated and much different to the Kursk region, which is much more open fields and not as many forest areas, where the Bryansk region is very foresty and it's very difficult for fighting to take place in such a region. It is similar to the northern regions of Ukraine near Kiev, Chernobyl, and the general border area between Ukraine and Belarus. It's very foresty and very difficult to fight through and establish supply lines for armored vehicles and operate armored vehicles compared to other regions in eastern, southern Ukraine and in the Kursk and Belgorod regions. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.